Thank you for joining us this morning. We're talking about student voice. So let's jump into that. If you've been with us before, which I recognize all of the names on here, we're going to do introductions though quickly. So I'm Emily Arkfeld. I serve Region 5 as Social Emotional Behavioral Learning Specialist, and my background was school social work. Mackenzie.
Morning, Mackenzie Rydell. I am the SEBL that serves Regions 1 and 2.
And I'm Jill Gunther. I'm the third SEBL Specialist, and I serve Regions 3 and 4. My background is speech language pathology and then special education leadership.
Thank you both. When we want to make sure that we are sharing what we even do, many of you come on this and hear wonderful resources and share what you are doing, and that is fantastic. But we want to make sure that we let you know that we provide more than these Coffee Connects. So we really want to offer that evidence-based professional development and implementation support around all things SEBL. And so we have a workshop series that you guys can go through as a district or an ESU, and then individual PD, like things like this, and then our screening webinar we put out, and our attendance one. And if there's anything else that you guys are looking for in your ESU or districts have asked for, please let us know, and we are happy to put things together for that, or resources, and partner in presenting that as well. We always start with a welcoming inclusion activity, get a feel for the room, get everyone on the same page and going in the morning. So this goes along with Mackenzie's question a little bit, as I feel like this ramping up to winter break is always so hard because you're excited to get there, but there's so much to be done beforehand. And so we just want to know if you would drop in the chat, actually. So one, you've taken time for yourself today, or if you're like me and you've just rolled out of bed to this right now. Two, you plan to take time for yourself today. Or three, who, me? Take care of myself? Who does that? So if you would drop that in the chat, I would appreciate it. Thank you all for participating. Jill dropped the link to the PDF slide in the chat. So if you want that pulled up already, that is in there for you. As a reminder, we have all of our previous Coffee Connects and resources connected to this Padlet. We wanted to keep things in one place. We know that it is growing big, but it is there for you to utilize, to share out. So please use as you want. Put all your own resources on there or questions if you see fit as well. In the spirit of other good news and updates, we have updated our definition. We had a conversation just really looking at aligning all of the work that's being done across the state of Nebraska. So we have our mental health institutes through our ESUs, and we believe that social emotional behavioral learning is a preventative factor in mental health. And so we wanted to add that to our definition. So now our definition in Nebraska NeMTSS is SEBL is a systematic process of fostering social and emotional skills among students and adults in order to create safe and supportive environments with positive behavioral and mental health outcomes for all. So you'll see that on all of our stuff as we continue putting out professional development. Again, we believe that we need those skills, those competencies in order to follow those behavior expectations, to have positive mental health outcomes, to increase our academics. And so we like to show our connection to PBIS and those expectations and the expectations with that. So here is our tie-in for all of that. And then, as always, here is our competency wheel. So we borrowed it from Castle, Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. We have our 5 competencies, and then we break out further from there some of those skills and what that might look like, knowing that these competencies are kind of this construct and a bigger idea. And so what does that really look like for our students and for the adults in our buildings? And we are Nebraska NeMTSS, and everything we do, we fit through our essential elements. And we believe that if you are doing things systematically with all of this in mind, then whatever you're doing has a better chance of being successful and being consistent over time. So getting into our topic today, talking about student voice. There's a lot of great information out there. We have lots of stuff in here. We've linked lots of it into the Padlet. But if this starts you on a journey or keeps you rolling on a journey, know that there is lots of stuff out there to help support you along that. So the student voice in PBIS implementation defines student voice as, or including student voice in PBIS implementation defines it as collective decision-making process where youth are involved in making decisions that shape their lives of themselves as their peers. And so it's really that decision-making with students and not for students. And we added in the whole child wheel here because really these decisions that shape their lives should be in all of these different areas. And so how do we get student voice in all of these areas and not just about, does this lesson work for me? Or do I feel I belong here? But is my school providing me what I need? And do I have the opportunity to learn how to advocate for what I believe in and what I'm passionate about and what is going on in my community? And do I have a safe place to speak about that? And so we wanted to make that connection for you, and we'll give some other topics on that as we continue. And then taking that one step further, this Sound Out website and resource that has been linked in here has again, a wealth of information. And we really liked this piece that student voice is not, we don't want to seek student voice just from those easy to reach, high achieving student council type students, that every student has a perspective, has their own individual perspective on what is happening in their school and in their district and in their community. And we want to make sure that we are giving all of them the opportunity to speak about their individual experience and their perspective, so that we are gathering that whole picture and then really providing the best opportunities for all students, whatever level they might be at. And when we actively seek out for students to have input, it increases their buy-in, which, then just increases their sense of belonging, their connectedness, their academics, their success rate, their graduation rate, all of those positive things. And so really, we want to make sure we're giving those students opportunities to share their thoughts, opinions, and be leaders, whatever that might look like, in developing and improving the school, to help create that positive school climate and culture where everyone wants to be and stay. And it keeps our adults and our other educators, because they feel it's a safe space and that they feel that they belong as well and they're making a difference. So really, it is all full circle. We have a video for you here. This is just a short snippet of it. It's about a 6.5 minute video altogether. If you want to watch the whole thing, if you thought this was good and want to share it out with your staff, that is linked in here and in the Padlet. And there's another great one also on student feedback and student voice that is linked in the Padlet as well. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and then I'm going to hand it off to Mackenzie.
When social emotional learning is successfully integrated school-wide, student perspectives and experiences shape daily school life. Staff engage students as leaders, problem solvers, and decision makers.
When we think about youth voice, there are two things we think about. First is the youth themselves. Do they have the competence, the skills, the confidence to use their voice? And secondly, are the adults in that space creating opportunities for the youth to be heard? What it looks like in a classroom can be anything from the youth leading the instructional time. Even kids as young as kindergarten can lead that circle time and facilitate discussion among their peers. It can also look like students serving on committees to help problem solve in the school. So it's important that they are real decision-making collaborators, not simply just planning prom or a safety patrol.
All right, so we'll get into it a little bit, but Castle has this school guide for social emotional learning, and we've shared a lot of bits and pieces as we go through various topics. But one of the indicators is youth voice and engagement, and so you'll see some resources from Castle around that indicator. And yeah, And later on in the video, like Emily said, it's a little bit longer if you want to watch the whole thing, but somebody comes on and talks a little bit about how if students feel safe to speak out in their school, they will say it. Sometimes we don't always hear those voices because we're not seeking them out, or we're not creating the safe environments where people feel like they can share. And so as we kick off today, we wanted to hear from you all about how you are incorporating student voices in your schools, or if you can't think of examples, just talk about what comes to mind when you hear or think about youth voice and engagement. So you can unmute, or you can put it in the chat.
In some of my work, I think it's just making sure that there's a space at the table in the conversation for youth, and being intentional about including them as a stakeholder in the development or the work that we're doing as it with districts or buildings.
Yeah, thank you.
I will just say that I think that the districts in my area have tried really hard to get students involved with the PBIS, them on team members. Sometimes that's harder when the team wants to meet at 7:15. You don't have kids that volunteer for that very often. But even as when I taught high school special education, I know it's not necessarily a whole school-wide process, but I had students leading their own IEP. So their voice was at the table in that. And so giving them that confidence there, the hope was it would grow into other things too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great examples. All right. Well, feel free to jump in on and share if you still want to. So when we think about student voice, I guess, okay, so that video talked about shared decision making, problem solving. Really, that goes into those SEBL competencies, the self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And so we just pulled out some examples of how, when we're using student voice, how that might tie into those competency skills. And so when you think about self-awareness, students sharing their perspectives and their values, and maybe using some of their personal strengths, and pulling from that as they're taking part in sharing their voices. It also makes them think and reflect on themselves, and maybe their identities or their experiences and how that has shaped them, having to express themselves and be able to talk in front of people and their peers and their adults, and then gaining awareness of what their voice might sound like, which ties into self-management of being aware of your perspective and then using your voice effectively, being able to speak up in situations, but also understand that maybe I don't need to speak up in every situation, or maybe I need to spread the love and let other people share their voice. So kind of figuring out some of those self-management skills. It also goes into organizational skills and goal setting, part of the self-management competency. The social awareness, sharing voices leads to varying perspectives. So hitting on that perspective taking skill, understanding people have differing opinions, being able to listen to others' perspectives and maybe understand why that might be different than their own. And then being able to communicate with other people, different audiences. I know speaking with your peers is a lot different than speaking with your adults or authority figures or people in leadership roles. And so figuring out what that might look like. And then relationship skills, again, with that communication, engaging with others, problem solving is a big part of this competency. understanding and sharing ideas and solutions and working together is really, when we think of student voice and we think of high engagement of student voice, really it's a lot of student-led stuff, and it's not just one student leading it, it's a group. So figuring out how to work in groups. And then responsible decision-making, again, problem solving here, thinking about challenges, evaluating the consequences of what may or may not come of certain changes, working together to help challenge things going on or bettering things for not only themselves, but also their schools and their communities. And so I think, personally, I think you can intertwine those SEBL competencies into everything that we do. I think we've really tried to hit on that throughout different examples throughout the topics this fall. But this is just a good example of how student voice incorporates those competencies. So I mentioned earlier the CASEL, they have this school-wide SEL indicators, and they have a rubric that goes along with it. And so as one, I guess, score or indicator on that rubric, you can reflect on some questions on how you are engaging in student voice. So this specific rubric is specific to the SEL systematic implementation. So it is really considering how you're incorporating student voice in the SEL type initiatives in your school. So some of those questions might be, do staff honor and elevate a broad range of student perspectives and experiences by engaging them as leaders, problem solvers, and decision makers? You might also ask, do students have a lot of opportunities to take on those leadership roles within those SEL initiatives? While we are focusing on SEBL specifically, we also want to give some examples of what that can look like a little more broad. And as Emily mentioned earlier, we want to get student voice not only in those SEL initiatives, but also within our PBIS teams, within our student health, mental health, in the classrooms. There's a lot of areas where we can engage student voice. You may have heard of, I think it's Hart's ladder of student voice. There are lots of images out there. And so we have a couple different examples and links. But we have a couple examples we'll go through. But we kind of combined them to these 4 minimum, basic, mid, and high levels of engaging student voice. And then we'll give some more specific examples of what that could look like at each level. But when we think of engaging student voice and at the minimum level, we really think of students as data sources. We might be gathering some surveys, looking at those ops discipline referrals, all good practices, but we're using what we have existing that isn't specifically asking and getting the opinions of our students. It's really just taking some information that involves our students. And so as you go from lower engagement to higher engagement, you could imagine that the way that you're interacting with students, the way that you're getting information, it really kind of shifts from being adult oriented, adult centered to youth driven, depending on what you're asking them to do. And so at those lower levels, students as data sources, then maybe students being heard, they're sharing their voices, but maybe it's the adults still leading those initiatives. The adults are maybe telling students, hey, we want you to do this. And then they might share their opinions and their voices. And then the adults might take that into consideration when making decisions. And then as you move to the mid and high levels, you're really using students as collaborators. So that this would be where those student-led conferences and student-led IEPs are at. you're sharing with students, but you're kind of like maybe co-facilitating, or you're working with them in a partnership. Maybe they might have some leadership role. And then the high levels is really those students as leaders. They're kind of they're in the conversations, they're sharing their opinions, and the adults are really being the supportive figures. They are there, they're ready to help. They can kind of help lead as needed, but they are, the students are really the ones in the driver's seat. I think historically, we tend to sit on the minimum and basic level just because it does take planning and effort and students to volunteer to wake up at 7:15 to join meetings to have some more incorporation. But as you continue these processes and you kind of figure out where you can get student voice and where you can really engage the students, I think you can move from the minimum to basic to more mid and high. And really, when you think about it, our students are the reason that we are in business. And so we really want them to share their perspectives of what they think needs to happen. And I think back to when I was in school and the things that happened versus when my little sister, who's still in high school, the things that she's going through, they're just so different. And so as we're in schools, you all know that it changes throughout the years of what that might look like. Curriculum changes, administration changes, there's new initiatives here and there, but also our students are changing in their needs, and the things that might be issues now for our students maybe wasn't even in consideration in years past. And so continuously speaking their voice and figuring out what they need or what their opinions are can really help continuously build those positive cultures and climates within our schools. Another example here, this is a youth voice continuum from the Comprehensive Center Network. We like this, it's a little small, but there is a link there and you can print it out on a piece of paper. It's a little bigger than, but it kind of goes through the varying levels, and same concept as you see on the left. It says students have no voice, and then on the right is going all the way to organizing and governing. That would be the students doing that. And you can see the arrows on the top. On the left side, it's more adult-centered, and then in the middle, it's youth-centered, but still the adults are highly involved, and then the right side is youth-driven. And we like this because it gives examples of what that might look like for the youth and the adults. And so, for example, when you think of the partnership column, that green one with a handshake, it's youth initiated. They're collaborating with teachers and adults. They're co-creating that environment with the adults and the staff. But then the adults get to play the part in collaborating and being learners and taking into the knowledge of the youth and valuing that and really holding them as experts in some specific areas. And so we like those examples. It could be a good tool to look at and see where you're at in engaging voice. I do want to say that we don't necessarily have to have students at the top, at the youth-driven part for every single thing in our school. We know that sometimes there's conversations that need to be had that probably shouldn't have students at the table being that leadership, making those decisions. And so when you think about the different initiatives you're having, the different things, you definitely want to get student voice in some capacity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be driving all of the decisions being made. But throughout the day-to-day, we still want to get their voices. Okay, so we're going to dive into some different examples. Like I said, we'll go from that minimum, basic, mid, and high and go through some of those. And so at the minimum level, as you might remember, it's students being data sources. So here we just listed a bunch of different data sources that we tend to pull from. And so you have grades, your benchmark assessment, state testing, all those academic marks. You might look at suspension and expulsion rates, office discipline referrals and attendance, nurse visits. Maybe your screening shows some of those risk behaviors. Might look at parent and caregiver reports and communications, all things that are really good information that, yes, we want to use data in making decisions. That is a huge essential element of NeMTSS. But when thinking about student voice, this again is just numbers, but also in addition to data, it's important to get that voice being heard. And so at the minimum level, we're not necessarily hearing the perspectives of students, we're just seeing the numbers on the page. And so when we move to basic, we think of maybe some student feedback surveys or some ways to hear student voices. Again, this is more adult-led. Some examples of how we could do this is by doing conversation circles. We pulled these from the Synergy project. So Lee Colborn and Linda Beggs, they have a book on incorporating student voice. They have some good resources. So we pulled this from them. So conversation circles, that could look like, this is mostly group focused. And so you might put on like butcher block or a big chart paper, or you could even do it maybe on like a PowerPoint and share it with the students, or even just open in a conversation and hear what people have to say, but you kind of give them some sentence stems and then hear back from them. So an example could be a great teacher is, or a great teacher says, or they do, or they don't do X, Y, and Z. And then you have the students complete the sentence, and then you have all that information for what they're kind of thinking. You could ask about administration. If they were an administrator for a day, one thing they would change is X, Y, Z. Or if my school really knew me, they would know blank. So that is a good way to engage in hearing some of those student opinions. And then you could also target the questions for what you're wanting to know information about. But generally, this is more general student perspective, not very specific things. And then off-track interviews, these would be an example of more of a individual kind of based. And so you're gathering information, you're trying to strengthen the relationships with students and determine next steps for those students that might be at risk of dropping out, or they might be off track on that graduation route. And so this would be kind of an interview format where you're asking them about their school experiences. What could the school have done differently? When did you get off track? What was going on during that time? So really like getting information, but also trying to build up that relationship, because we know when students feel like they belong to the school and they have a trusting adult within their school environment, they're more likely to be more invested in their schooling. We have some examples in the Padlet of different off-track interviews. There's a parent off-track interview. There's one for students in high school, and there's also one that's elementary focused. Thank you, Lona, for coming. I hope you enjoy your conference today. So when we think of student feedback forms, this would be a way to help increase student engagement, to prevent discipline, bullying prevention. And then once you get some information, you could follow up one-on-one with students. You could look for general patterns. You could maybe solve some of those problems that are coming up on those surveys. So we have a couple different examples also in the Padlet. I think there's a couple examples from Castle. There's one from Edutopia that has some questions. There's some survey formats or some like paper formats in the Padlet.
Awesome. Thanks, Mackenzie. So then kind of moving into that mid-range and really thinking about students as collaborators, and just to provide some examples of kind of what that can look like. So I know, I believe it was Lana that had mentioned like the student-led IEPs. That's a great example of when we're thinking about how we can really engage that student voice and really involve students as those collaborators in that process. But another great example is also just like student-led conferences. So we have a few links and some visuals here on this slide. So one of the first ones is kind of just a student-led conference guide, which kind of just provides some different steps when we're thinking about going through those student-led conferences. So a nice little visual for the students as well as the families, has a note to the families at the bottom there as well. So if you're currently participating or engaging in kind of those student-led conferences, this would be a great tool that you could kind of adapt and change or use as is. Going back to those student-led IEPs, we also have some templates linked in there. So if students are putting together like a slide deck or a PowerPoint, going over the information from their IEP as part of that IEP process, some templates there, as well as a person-centered planning tool, which was developed for students with disabilities, but has a lot of just great pieces embedded within that tool that could be used for all students to really work to engage that student voice. And really, when we're thinking about using students as collaborators. And then also co-creating classroom norms. So we have a link in there for that as well. So really thinking about how we can have those conversations and really engage students when we're identifying those classroom norms. What can that look like? So they can really have that ownership during that process. But then it also really targets a lot of those SEBL competency skills. So if we're thinking about those 5 competencies and the skills that fall within, we're really targeting those relationship skills. We're really targeting that social awareness and that responsible decision making. So many great things can be targeted through just some of these different examples. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide here is that student-directed IEP Continuum at the top. That's, again, just a really nice visual when we're thinking about kind of the different stages of that student involvement. So kind of, again, if we're thinking about those steps or those rungs, so kind of that basic all the way to that high, how we can involve them. So just a few great resources as we're thinking about that collaboration piece. Another example, so we had someone mention just kind of those PBIS teams or those SEBL teams as well. So this is another great example of really engaging those students as collaborators here as well. So we have that TFI and our PBIS coaches can certainly chime in here as well, but having those students as part of the representation team is a part of that. Again, we have some links in here when we're thinking about what are the key roles and responsibilities when we have those students as part of that SEBL team or part of that PBIS team. Really thinking about supporting those student members on the SEL team. So those are some great resources that we have linked in there as well. But again, thinking about all the great skills that they can gain from that team membership, thinking about how we can really have that authentic voice as part of those decision-making processes within the school, whether it be for events, but also thinking about it in terms of the policies, the procedures, things like that, those everyday things that are going to have a huge impact on them and how we can really gain that voice during those processes. I also just kind of wanted to point out here that I think Mackenzie had mentioned earlier that we can have kind of a wide range of that involvement for students as well. So if we don't have student voice currently engaged in our building, how can we start small and then just continue to build and grow upon that? And so even thinking about those students as part of that PBIS or SEBL team, they might start kind of more at that like basic level of participation where maybe they're a part of the team. They maybe are offering some input or completing some surveys, or we're gaining information there, but they're not really part of that decision making or that implementation process. But maybe we just continue to grow that involvement to where they are that full team member as well. And they really are participating in those, but then they're part of that decision making process. They have that role in implementing solutions and things like that. Again, just thinking about all of the skills. So gaining those leadership skills, gaining those facilitation skills, and really engaging to gain those perspectives so that we can just continuously improve. And again, Emily mentioned it earlier, but really thinking about how we can engage those students that maybe don't offer some of that information. They're maybe not our students that are involved in all of the different activities, the student council and things like that. But really thinking about how we can engage those students that aren't already thriving. Mary, you had something to share. Go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to mention one of my high schools, just as you were saying, Jill, they were trying to increase their student engagement. And so they at first had students who they gave them some tasks and they said, would you like to do any of the following? And one of them might have been like, come to the meeting and talk about some of the upcoming activities. One was do videos to help teach some of the expectations or ways to behave in school. And so they chose that and did that. And they tried to make sure that they didn't just have the head of the student council and the kids with straight A's. They recruited some kids who were just like, average students or who maybe weren't famous in school. And some of those students were the ones who kept coming to the meetings and wanted to stay involved. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. I love that example. Thanks for sharing that, Mary. Opportunities to provide student choice is also a great example. So obviously thinking about choice in partners or grouping or seating are great ways, but also just projects and other ways to learn content. So another great link on here. So how to demonstrate learning. This is a great way to really engage student voice within their learning. So where they can choose to show their learning in a variety of different ways. So maybe it's through a sculpture, maybe it's through a dance, maybe it's through a research essay, maybe it's a graph, a cartoon. So you get the idea of all of those different ways that they can show that they've learned that content, but providing that maybe as like a think tic-tac-toe or like a bingo where they have to get the bingo or they have to get the tic-tac-toe by completing those different ways to complete that learning. So if you click on that link, that has just a variety of different ways that we could provide students that choice in learning. So a great resource there as well. Moving into just kind of that high level. So thinking about student advisory committees. So as you guys can see here, so really working with students to engage them in working with their peers around issues that they care about to really get them involved in the current events that are occurring within their school, within their community, and really within the country. So finding productive ways so that they can engage and exercise their voice. It's a just great way, like we've mentioned, some of the different skills, but so many different skills when we're thinking about engaging student voice. So we've listed some of those on there. We've mentioned some of them throughout, but different clubs and activities, also a great way to really have them not just be a part of those clubs and activities, but really have a voice in putting together what the goals of those different clubs are, what that can look like. So again, we have like the student council listed on there, but other things like diversity, equity, and inclusion groups, things like that. So just kind of thinking outside the box and how we can really involve students within those different groups and really make them those student advisory committees, awareness campaigns, peaceful protests, things like that. So thinking about those pieces. This student SEL data reflection protocol, again, we have that linked there in the slide, but really when we're thinking about understanding school data and how we can involve students in that school data piece and having the part in that decision making, this is a great tool that just kind of walks through some of the different steps to help engage students, to help them kind of understand the data and have those discussions, those reflective questions, things like that through there. So we wanted to offer that as another tool as you are working to engage student voice. And then that brings us to our date. So this is just our save the date for this next semester. So January through May. So we have our dates on there. We also have a link and a QR code if you have not already registered for our upcoming Coffee Connects. And we will get some more information around the topics for each of those months as well. So if you click on that link, that will share some of that information with you as well. And then an exit ticket. So we always like to just gain your guys' feedback. If you guys have any questions, any topics that you would like to see us cover kind of in future Coffee Connects, we would love to hear that feedback as well. Our January Coffee Connect is January 25th. And we are going to really be talking about some just positive practices as we start the new year. So as we ring in 2023. So Emily just put the exit ticket link in the chat so you guys can click on that. We would love to have you guys fill that out and provide us just with some feedback. And then we'll move into our optimistic closure. So just thinking about some of the different examples that we shared with you today, some of the different resources, what's one thing that you want to try to do to incorporate around student voice for next semester? And so if you would like to share out, we would love to hear your voices. Otherwise, you can certainly put it in the chat as well. And then just a side note, Mackenzie just dropped in the link for the registration for the Spring Coffee Connect for next semester as well.
So my name is Derek Lamb. In my role at ESU1, I work with counselors. And so I'm just trying to gather resources to be able to help support our schools and especially our counselors. In our schools, it seems like the counselors do a lot with trying to provide these things. So as far as like the student voice, I really like the different levels, that ladder, and just trying to give specific examples of what each one of those levels is. So thank you for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great example, and being able to just kind of like we talked about continually to, just move up that ladder too, and how can we continue to improve that?
And we talked, sorry, Mackenzie, at the same time. So there was a PBIS network meeting just at the end of last month or early this month. And we talked about, hold on. You had said it. Oh, that there needs to be some trust built from both sides. So teachers and educators need to trust the students in giving their voice, and the students need to trust that the educators will listen and follow through. And so we talked about how do we even just start with some small things where students say, hey, we would like this, or this would be great if this could change. And if you can even just do that small thing to say, we hear you, we're listening, and we're making this change, that just helps build that trust. So it doesn't have to be these giant things. But like Jill said, like just even starting small and then building from there.
Yeah, so specifically thinking, so last year in my role at a school, students were asking for like a change of lunch. Like, hey, what about, could we pick lunch? And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting one that would be pretty simple, I feel like. But that might build some of that trust, and again, adults could say, well, here's what you can choose from, but anyhow.
Yeah, I think that's a great example and a great way to, like you said, start small and just continue to build. I like that. All right. Well, let us know if you guys have any questions. Thanks for joining us today. If you, again, will just fill out that exit form for us, we would love to have you complete that. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.